This episode of Shadiversity has a very special sponsor. It is Audible. And in case you guys didn't know, I've actually been trying to get an Audible sponsorship for ages. Because if there is any product that I can endorse without hesitation, it is Audible. I've been signed up for years, literally years, okay? So if you want to take Audible up on its 30-day free trial, you will get your first audiobook for free if you use this link, audible.com/Shadiversity. And if you live in the US, you can text Shadiversity to 500-500. Now, when I've said that I've used Audible for years, I really did mean it. Just have a look at my Audible library, okay? Audible has an unmatched selection of audiobooks, including special Audible exclusives that you can find nowhere else. Listening to an audiobook is my favorite way to read a novel. Even though you're not technically reading a novel, but that's probably why I enjoy it so much, because someone is reading it to you, and I really recommend it if you haven't tried it already. If you're wondering which book to try out first, might I suggest Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, okay? We do a lot of analysis of fantasy on my channel here, looking at ways to make fantasy more engaging and realistic, and Brandon Sanderson does this to a phenomenal level. So, if you haven't given Audible a go, and you're looking at trying something new for the new year, I highly suggest Audible. Remember, you can get Brandon Sanderson's The Final Empire, first book in the Mistborn series, for free with a 30-day trial membership. Just use the link in the description below or type in this URL, www.audible.com/Shadiversity, and if you're in the US, you can simply text Shadiversity to 500-500. So a big thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video. Love them to bits and highly recommend it. Trust me, you'll enjoy it. And now, let's get to the video.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this video I'm going to be looking at one of the coolest elements of castle design, a kind of deep dive, but with a video dedicated to this subject. You guys, you know what I have to do. And so, headphone warning, we gotta do it. Join with me if you want to. Matriculations! Or if you didn't understand that, machicolations. Why do I scream it? Because it's awesome. All right, so machicolations, let's go into the deep dive of it. Now, I have referred to machicolations many times. I made a whole video dedicated onto why, certain castle, well, basically medieval buildings, but also castle things had an extension in the upper floors. And I explained machicolations in that video, in that they are a design which enables the defenders of a castle to fire down on people who are adjacent to the castle wall in regular battlements and stuff like that. The only way to fire down on people right at the castle base is to lean out in between the crenellations, exposing yourself and firing down, and you probably get shot and dead. But by extending those battlements and having a gap in between, that enables you to shoot right down while still remaining behind the battlements. So very cool, very clever design. There is more to machicolations than just this, okay? There are questions that have arisen that you guys have asked me and stuff like that I want to answer in this video. This is the deep dive, the detailed analysis and stuff of machicolations, how they're built, and also a lot of the whys and functionality behind them. So I'll start with how they are built. The battlement needs to be extended off the rampart, okay? But not just off, it needs to be extended so much so that there's a gap between the battlements and the ramparts to enable the holes in between, but something needs to hold up those battlements. And so you start with a thing called corbels. Now, a corbel is basically an extension of stone outside of the stone wall, which enables you to rest something atop of it. Corbeling has been used in many architectural designs and constructions for things other than machicolations, okay? In actual fact, corbelling is one method in which intermediate floors are actually put inside castles, because you have the corbel and you can rest the beam that holds the floor on top of that corbel. Being made out of stone, they have great compressive strength and can support a significant amount of weight. So the corbeling itself could be made out of separate parts, or they could be made out of one solid chunk of stone. There are many examples of different types of corbels that we can see from real castles that have survived through to the modern day that were built in the medieval period. So we can get our inspiration from all these references. The thing is though, there is a gap or a space in between these corbels, and stone, this depends, okay, because there are ways in which you can just get a larger kind of slab of stone, put it right in between those, corbels and span the distance. The problem is that slab, if it gets put under too much pressure, stone is usually great with pressure, and so if the upper part of the stone is falling in, it'll fall under compression and it'll be stable. But the bottom part of the stone, if that starts to get pushed down, that bottom part could then come under tension, and stone, not good under tension, okay? And so there's a chance that that slab could actually break away and fall underneath it. So the way in which you can make a more secure kind of span in between these corbels is to make an arch. An arch is this beautiful architectural structure in which all pressure and weight placed on it puts the supporting arch under compression. And stone is great with compression, becomes very stable, and so one of the more secure methods in spanning the distance between the corbels is by putting an arch there. That is why we have arches between corbels on many battlements with machicolations and such, but not all of them. Some of them have different designs, just like a stone slab spanning the distance. But these are the different designs that were implemented in historical battlements with machicolations, because the machicolation is technically the hole, all right? And so the corbelling and the span in between and the stone above it, that's technically the battlement, and the machicolation, the hole. And so right now we're talking about how the battlement is able to be constructed and extended off the wall to enable machicolations, but I'm actually describing the construction of the battlement part itself. Now, with the gaps in between these corbels properly spanned and secured, you can then build up on top of them, and you can complete the battlement, of course comprised out of crenellations, which are made through intermediate merlons, the tooth, and the crenelle, the gap in between. But there are some interesting questions that arise now with our machicolated battlement properly made and completed. And that is, well, there are kind of holes on the rampart. Is there a chance that you could fall through them? And how big were they? Well, it seems like the size of machicolations on it, they varied. And it came purely down to the architect and how big he wanted it. Of course, there would have been certain practical limitations, okay? You wouldn't want it too small that you couldn't throw large rocks through, because machicolations, they weren't just shot through with arrows and stuff, just heavy rocks thrown down on people adjacent to the wall. That works really well too. So you need big enough to accommodate rocks, but you don't want it too big, so because if it is too big, the people down at the wall could shoot up through the machicolations to get you. It will be far more difficult for them because they're further away, but there is that chance. And if it's too big as well, there's a greater chance that if you misstep, you could actually fall through it. And this is what the other question that people asked: what do you do about the holes? So there's a couple of answers that I've actually been able to find. One with an actual historical, reference point, and others kind of just logical sense. One answer is that they could have made wooden basic covers for them, okay? And it wouldn't be too difficult. You just make a couple of planks of wood and maybe some guide, bits underneath that slot into the machicolation covering the hole, and you could have a rope pull or just a wooden handle fixed to it to lift it out when they actually need to be used, and then you're not going to fall through while you're walking past them. This next one was actually shared to me by one of my viewers, and this is one of the things I love about you guys. I learned so much from you, and you guys love castles, and you can actually go to castles, right? Because you might live closer to them. I don't know, live in Australia, for crying out loud. But anyway, when some of you guys visit them, you send me pictures. Now, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, and I can't find a picture. I'm going to put the picture here so we can look at them, but right now, it's lost, okay? But he sent this picture to me, and I can recreate it on my 3D model. And he was showing me the machicolations, and he was asking me why it had to step up, because it had this design where it had the rampart, and before the machicolations, there was actually a step, a full step, and then a bit of a span of stone, then the machicolations and battlements. And when I looked at that, he was asking me why, and I was like, that really looks to be kind of like a protection barrier. If you're walking on this rampart, you are far less likely to step through a hole if access to the hole is actually on a step higher than the path you're walking on. So far less likely to fall through. And so this could very well have been a safety measure put into the design of this castle, and you wouldn't need the covers in the first place. Very possible. It is speculation though. I don't know definitively. And that's the kind of thing, when you're looking at castle design and trying to backwards engineer the methodology, it is ultimately comes down to a lot of speculation. But the speculation that is most logical is most likely to be the case. And I think this is a fairly logical answer. But that step kind of makes a bit of a distance barrier between you and the matriculations, and this kind of comes into the next question that people have raised with me about these interesting architectural designs that we see on castles, and it's that how close do you need to be to use them? And I think people kind of get a misunderstanding that you have to be right over on top of them to use. Not really the case. In regards to many of the defensive elements of a castle, so we're not just looking at matriculations now, this is the same when firing in between the crenellations, okay, in the crenelle between the merlons, and also firing through arrow loops on a castle. From people actually going to castles and trying it out with, you know, bows, arrows, crossbows and things like that, it's very difficult to use these things when you're standing right adjacent to them. They often are standing about half a meter to a meter away from them, and they've got their, you know, bow and arrow, and they're shooting through that gap from a distance. There's a couple of practical reasons that help determine why we think they were, you know, employed this way. One is that it's actually easier to kind of angle your shot at a distance than when you're cramped into this alcove. By being further away, there's less chance that any arrow fire that actually goes through that arrow loop or between the merlons will hit you, because the further are you away, the more angular kind of distance you have for that arrow to miss. If you're closer, even an arrow that has an angled distance like this, if you're closer, that angle could hit you, but if you're further away, well, suddenly there's a lot of area where that arrow will actually miss, so it helps to stand a little bit far away. And so even with matriculations, if you need to shoot through them, you don't need to be right over on top unless they're really close to the wall. But even if they are close to the wall, you can kind of just lean out with your hands, drop something on top of them, shoot down, keep a bit of distance, keep yourself much safer than if you're right, you know, looking through the hole or having your head in between the crenellations. There's an interesting thing I've observed when studying matriculations on actual, you know, historical castles, and it's the fact that the number of matriculations, or in the space in between, right, does not generally match or run in even concession to the crenellations above. So what do I mean? You don't generally have like 2 matriculations per every single merlon, or 3 to 2, or stuff like that. It seems to be fairly random, where they just measured out an appropriate distance for each matriculation determined by the distance of the corbels, and then when they came to the crenellations that, you know, the corbelling is holding up, they measured that separately as well, and however they ended up matching up was whatever. I am way too OCD to do that, even on my own castle. So when I do like castles, like the models I've been showing you and stuff, I always have the matriculations matching up in a correct kind of order to the merlons above, in such a way that there is always a matriculation that lines up with a merlon specifically. Sometimes I have it evenly to the exactness, where each merlon has a matriculation. Why I do that design is that I feel if you needed to approach this hole to drop something down, having something of higher, you know, cover protecting you was good. If you have a matriculation that's sitting right in between a crenelle and you needed to move up, well, your head might, you know, be fairly vulnerable to arrow fire in between those 2 merlons. But it's not to say that that's how it was done historically. Like I said, there doesn't seem to be any direct matching up of the matriculations or corbellings to the crenellations above them, but you can do that when you're designing castles, and I tend to like to do it because I'm OCD. The other thing I want to point out is that matriculations were not just employed to hold up a battlement, okay? As we see in many examples of historical castles, upper parts and sections of castles, towers and walls were extended and held up with corbelling, with matriculations underneath, with no actual battlement. It was just a wall with a roof. And there are even more examples of different styles of matriculations being used separate to holding up, you know, a battlement, a crenellated battlement. Yes, there are different types of matriculations. So there are some types of matriculations that kind of were used to house, you know, privies, extensions, or just sections of a wall that was just a bit of an extension, and they're roofed off, they're just sitting outside the wall to either be used defensively, and like I said, in some cases for a garderobe, which is basically a castle's toilet. We also see this kind of limited use matriculations on like gatehouses, where just above the gatehouse there was an extension in your matriculations, and much of the other battlements were not corbelled or extended out with matriculations in between. They just had regular, you know, battlement, but in the areas where they felt they were most needed or could be employed to a greater effect, they had matriculations. So they weren't used all the time. That's the other thing we should really point out. There are times when matriculations, as hard as this is for me to admit, there are times when they're just not needed. specifically when it's extremely difficult to near impossible for the enemy to reach the wall and get adjacent to it. If they're not even going to get there, there's no need for Machicolations. You can just have a flat wall with a crenellation atop of it. So there we go. This has been a more deep dive onto these glorious things, Machicolations, and answering many of the questions that you guys have brought up. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course, if you want to see more castle content and stuff, remember to subscribe, ring the bell so you don't miss an episode, and you can also check out many other castle videos that I have on this channel. I hope to see you there, and until then, farewell.